Hi guys, so today we're in Ireland and we've flown out here to see if there's anything to all these stories about fairies, elves, gnomes, the little people. I wanted to find out firsthand by talking to the locals, going to the countryside, talking to the old Shawnees or storytellers and ask them to tell me about their belief in fairies. So far, the greatest answer I got on the way here was from our taxi driver who said, if you want to see a leprechaun, drink 12 pints of Guinness and one will show up to you. But tonight we're going to be going over to the Brazen Head pub, which is one of Ireland's oldest pubs, to find out firsthand from a local folklorist who specializes in mythology and storytelling, who says he's sure of it, that these fairies are real, and he's going to tell us all about it. So come along with us on this journey. Now, how did you get started doing this, Philip?
Oh, I've been storytelling for God knows how long. You know, I'm interested in history, I'm interested in folklore, mythology, geography, and the whole lot just comes together nicely in storytelling. And in Ireland, the sense of place is very, very important. Some countries, the sense of place isn't important, but in Ireland, with Irish folklore, it's intrinsically tied up with the actual place. There's an Irish word called dinshankas, which means the lore of place, and really the Irish folk tale it's essential to tell it in the context of where it's set geographically.
Yes.
And that doesn't apply in a lot of countries, but certainly in Ireland it's a really key part. But I mean, because I do tour guiding as well, so I know the country and I just love the country, and it all just came together.
Now, I've heard there's a long tradition of storytelling in Ireland with the old Shawnees that would go in the old pubs and tell these stories. Now, when we bring it over to the topic of the fairies, it's my understanding that at one point there were the legends of the great Tuatha De Danann that came in and brought Yes, and brought the little people in with them.
Yeah, don't use the word little people. Jesus, don't use that. I mean, that's Tinkerbell with little wings on her back.
Yes.
Originally the other crowd, they were the same size as you and me. They just it was a parallel world.
Yes. And
they just kind of got smaller through time, and but they're not the little people, and that's such a Hollywood construct. It's just terrible. So we often refer to them as the good people, the other crowd. Very seldom actually use the word fairies.
I've heard that they can sometimes be mischievous, as we learned in William Butler Yeats' work with The Stolen Child, and that they love good storytelling and music and people who are being lively. Have you ever heard the stories where people go missing in these fairy rings, like the story of
Yeah. I mean, that's that people going missing regularly. I mean, getting lost in a fairy mist, or been abducted by the trooping fairies for their entertainment, and maybe been seen again, or maybe not been seen again. And in fact, I'll be talking about some of that later on tonight.
Does this happen still in the countryside, out in Ireland?
Does it happen still? Well, people go missing every year.
Moving on, people generally believe that there are two types of fairies: the trooping fairies and the little solitary fairies. Now, the trooping fairies, they're the ones that live in those beautiful palaces below ground. They didn't have much truck for humans. They kind of kept themselves to themselves. They might invite you back to show off their finery, but you wouldn't want to go wandering back there uninvited. Not very good. But as well as living in those palaces below ground, it was also said they lived in what were known as fairy forts. I don't know if any of you have been around the country. Have you seen any of these fairy forts? No? Well, yes, you have. Yeah, you have. Okay. For those who haven't, if I was to be historically accurate for a moment, they date back to the Bronze and Iron Age. They're circular in construction, made of earth or stone, or whatever was the predominant material available. Would originally have had a timber palisade fence around the top, and it was there that you'd build your house to keep your family and your animals safe from attack from wolves or cattle thieves. But it was said that when the humans moved out, the fairies moved in. There are thousands of those fairy forts all over the country, and they're the best protectors of Irish archaeology. As you ask most Irish people today, do you believe in fairies? They say, no, I don't believe in fairies, but I'm not touching that. there's so many stories of people who have desecrated these things or dug them up and all sorts of disasters before them. And like so many things, you can explain 99% of them, but there's always a percentage that you say, that's a bit hard to believe, hard to understand. Great respect be needed for the fairy forts, great respect be needed for the fairy music. Fairy music says to be the most enchanting ever. When you hear it, your feet take off and it's river dance times 100. Many stories of young girls being abducted by the fairies for their entertainment and maybe never being seen again or being left back thinking they've been gone overnight, but in fact they've been gone 7 years, time being different. Is that what it is?
You know, have you ever looked at the similarity between the extraterrestrial stories and the stories that we read about?
No, I'm not into science fiction.
Neither am I.
Yeah.
It's just it's incredible how people say about this missing time and all this. So with the fairies and the little people, that we don't use that term anymore. You know, I've heard that there's various types of these beings. You know, the sylphs, the salamanders, the gnomes. Do you still tell stories about all of them?
Yeah. Well, it's not. The characters are different. I mean, I think every culture on Earth has its own lore, and I have stories. About Irish folklore. And I have the exact same story in a Japanese version.
Yes.
You know, I say, well, how does that story? I have one story, The Legend of Knockgrafton, which was written down by a guy called T. Crofton Croker in 1821. And I have the exact same story in a Japanese context in an old book of Japanese folk tales. So how does it get from Southern Ireland to Japan, or from Japan to Southern Ireland? I just think there's common motifs. About good, evil, right, wrong, fear, lust, hate, all that.
Yes.
And just different civilizations that just manifest itself in different ways. But linking it to extraterrestrial stuff, that's to me now is getting into, you know, that's whoa.
You see, this is the point I was trying to make there. It's the same one that you were trying to make, or that you did make, is that you look at the mythologist Joseph Campbell, you look at Emmanuel Velikovsky, and they look all over the world, and they saw similarities with these stories that they're happening everywhere.
Yeah.
And I was just thinking that maybe people were trying to modernize their interpretation, but this has been happening all along.
So I've talked to several people in Ireland now that believe in fairies, and they still are very superstitious about plowing over a fairy mount in the field or a fairy fortress because of the bad luck that comes with it. And then I've talked to others, such as Philip at the Brazen Head Pub in Dublin, who almost seem to imply that many of these fairy stories might have been explanations from people at the time of areas like the Irish potato famine, trying to explain away crop failures and weather abnormalities due to the fairies, sort of a primitive explanation. And then I had another conversation with my friend David Halpin, who is a researcher and writer out here in Ireland, who looked at the possibility of there being a Jungian psychological explanation of seeing how these could be personifications, these bees could be personifications of various issues. But the further I've also gone out into the countryside, I've now talked to some people with wonderful stories about fairies, and they have all pointed me in the direction of talking to a fellow named Sean, and he lives way out here in one of Ireland's most haunted castles there is. In fact, it's not only over 700 years old, but there was a gruesome, bloody murder scene there at around 1532 in the 16th century. And actually, there were several of them at this place in the floor just above the entrance, from what I've read. But people tell me that this gentleman is truly wonderful, and he's a historian of all this ancient Irish knowledge, and he plays the whistle and tells these stories so well and preserves all this knowledge. So we're going to drive out and we're going to go meet him and talk to him and ask him if he'll share some of these stories with us and tell us if he's had any experiences. So come along with our adventure. Let's go check it out now.
Sean, how long have you lived here for?
I'm living here in the castle for about 15 years.
Wow. And could you tell us a little bit about the background of this place?
Well, this was burned down, and all the floors at this level were bombed out during the Irish Civil War. And it was just left then as crumbling shell, and we bought it in 1991. We were in the middle of a recession at that time, so it was very cheap because there was nobody interested in it, and I suppose, a lot younger and had lots of energy. And in early '94 then, I started the restoration. And that's what I've been doing since then. Most of the time on my own, but of late, I have a young man that comes and helps me. My knees are gone, so I get help maybe 1 or 2 days a week to do things.
That's incredible. And people say all over the place when we talk to them about this place that it's haunted. Or as you were saying, that it's not so much haunted, but there are spirits that
Well, haunted isn't the word we use, but there are, lots of spirits in the house. But they've never interfered with us or made life difficult in any way. But they do let us know they're here.
How do they do that? Do they appear to you? Or?
Well, they let us know in many ways. We hear them. I suppose we kind of hear them a good bit at night. It's not a nighttime thing only. It's so quiet when we lock up here at night. Well, it's like footsteps. It's like people walking around. We hear doors opening and closing. Another thing we hear, it's like, we say, a crowd of people in another room all talking. Now, you can't actually make out anything that's been said, but the thing about it is, we say you heard it down there now, and you were sure it was coming from there, but if you go there, it's not. It's always someplace else. You're never at it, if you know what I mean.
Yes.
Yeah, and the footsteps we hear aren't on the floors we have now, or the doors we hear opening and closing aren't our doors. But you see, where you are, it's 700 years old, so the changes that would have been made by every other generation or whatever would be enormous, like, you know.
Wow.
Yeah.
Now, I know you have a vast knowledge of Irish history and you know about Irish folklore. Could you tell me a little bit about the Irish belief in the good people or the fairy folk? Is that still something that folks out here believe in, or do they have encounters like that?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Oh.
Of course, yeah.
And could you tell me a little bit about the Irish belief and the Banshee?
Well, the Banshee is a different thing. It's nothing got to do with the fairy thing.
Interesting. So it's said that every Irish family has a Banshee.
No,
No, they
no,
don't.
only certain families.
Interesting.
Where did you learn that?
Well, I've read about the Banshee, and also some folks said that they heard screaming at times when someone was going to.
Yeah, but that's associated with certain families only.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Now, with the fairy folk, do they only congregate out in these fairy mounds? Or are they just everywhere?
Yeah, no. They're in the fairy forts.
Oh wow!
Yeah.
Have you yourself ever encountered?
I absolutely have.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Can you talk about it at all?
I can play you a tune that we learned from the fairies called The King of the Fairies.
Wow, I would love that if you could. That was beautiful.
It's King of the Fairies, yeah.
He taught you that tune.
That's right, yeah.
Now, when we talk about fairies, I've talked to some people that talk about the sylphs, the salamanders, the gnomes, the undines.
They've nothing got to do with Ireland, though.
Now, that's right. And now with these fairies, some I've talked to have seen fairies show up that are this about this small, and some have said they're as tall as you and I.
No, they're Shio, they're tiny, yeah.
That's interesting. What about the Irish belief in the leprechaun?
I don't know. The leprechaun was always there. I've never met a leprechaun. Now, my grandfather did, and he told me lots of stories about the leprechauns. I've never come across them. He spoke on how they were depicted mostly as shoemakers or shoe menders, and they would be heard knocking on their last, but you would have to creep up on them, because if they hear you, they just disappear. So, but if you grab them, they'll stay with you. But once my grandfather did that, grabbed one of them, and you see, it's supposedly, I'm not 100% sure about this, but they have kind of what's called a crock of gold, and it's usually buried someplace. So my grandfather, anyway, spoke with him and said, I have you now, I have you caught, and I won't release you until you tell me where the crock of gold is. And anyway, the leprechaun said to him, he said, it's buried over under that Buchalan buoy over there. And so that was fine. So my grandfather let him go, and he went back up to the house and he got a shovel to dig under the Buchalan buoy. And so when he came down, the whole field was covered with Buchalan buoys.
Wow.
So they couldn't find the right one. They could be digging yet.
Wow. Now, I've heard that the little people like good music, storytelling, and anyone having laughter and joy, that they surround those places and come out. Is it true?
Oh, yeah.
So that's what draws them in. And also, Reverend Kirk wrote about these, the little people being sort of a subterranean sort.
Subterranean, yeah.
Yeah, they
disappear into the ground at night.
And was that after when the two after the Dan were going, they disappeared on Ireland, or they were
That's
going
right.
underground?
They went underground, yeah, when the Faerie Faith came.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's incredible. What do they typically appear like to people when they encounter them?
Oh, it's like normal people, but tiny. And they love music, and they seem to party an awful lot because there's always revelry going on.
Yes, and I've heard of people having missing time, like in the story of Rhys and Llewellyn, and the fairy rings that show up. I've heard that sometimes people can disappear when they come towards them.
Yeah, yeah. But what was the thing about Llewellyn? That's nothing to do with Ireland. That's Welsh.
Oh, that's a Welsh tale.
Oh,
Yeah.
I don't think so.
Yes, it was an old story of Rhys and Llewellyn, where one went towards the fairy ring because they heard dancing and music, and they one friend went missing, and then was gone for a couple of days, and then people said, "Hey, that's kind of strange."
Yeah, I'm sure that's probably Welsh, but it's similar to our tradition as well.
Wow.
We do have, as you know, the Faerie Faith, and I mean, even in bad times, during the famine, even when people were hungry, they still would not go in and plough or sow in the Faerie Faith, because it would bring. There was my grandfather also told me one time that one neighbour once went in bad times to plough a Faerie Faith with a pair of horses, and when he got up the following morning, the two horses were dead.
Yes. That's incredible. Now, around this property, I assume that there's a lot of fairy areas. Yes.
Well, this was a ceremonial site anyway.
Incredible. Could you tell us a bit more about this area then, this specific place? Because this is a very special area we're in.
Oh yeah, well, it is, yeah.
Would you be able to just tell me what your thoughts on the Druids, if you don't mind? If you could tell me about the Druids in Ireland.
Well, the Druids, they were the priests, I suppose, who carried out the ceremonies on sites like this. This was an ancient, very important site because it overlooks mountains over there called the Slieve Bloom Mountains. Slieve would be the Gaelic or the Irish word for a mountain. Bloom is an anglicisation of Blama, and Blama was one of their great gods, and he lived in those mountains. And there would have been sites like this all around where they honoured their god Blama. So this would have been an ancient ceremonial site.
Wow, that's incredible. Well, thank you so much, Sean, for sharing your wisdom and the history with us. It's a very much a pleasure. Thank you. Thank you so
We
much.
decided to drive out to Killarney in search of another Shawnee or a storyteller that could tell us about the Irish belief in fairies or the little people. But most of the locals that we talked to in the local pubs and asking around said there was one, but he had passed away, and then others told us that the one that was there moved away. Either way, we were directed to drive out into the Ring of Kerry, which you absolutely have to see if you ever come to Ireland. You can't see Ireland unless you drive around the Ring of Kerry. There's ancient ruins of stone circles and castles scattered around, the original Ogham alphabet, and so much more. But we were directed to this place, the Hill of Kerry, or the Walk of Kerry, which is supposed to be an enchanted forest where people often encounter fairies and the little people, much like you hear about in these old stories. But, examining the stories of fairy encounters, we're usually told there are various types of beings. There is these beings known as sylphs, which can be as tall as you or I, or as others have said, like Sean, that we just talked to. They can be this small and be like the little Tinkerbell creatures that fly around. Some encounter them to be just looking like you and I in regular clothes, and they like to party and be mischievous and, get up to no good and have fun. But there's other stories of other classes of fairy beings. Some have said the undines are mermaids or merpeople, which have existed in folklore, are part of the fairy kingdom. We also hear about gnomes and dwarves that live near the rocks, and they're sort of associated with the mineral kingdoms. But one thing is for certain, these beings have always been associated with the elementals and being out in nature, and they most certainly like to inhabit areas like trees, rocks, and bushes and meadows, and they don't like to be disturbed. Now, we've heard all kinds of traditions about how to see them so far, and if you want to have a fairy encounter, you go to a place like this, in this beautiful forest out here in Ireland. And what some have said is that traditionally there is an Irish tradition of tween places and tween times. Now, a tween place is typically seen as if you look over there in between two branches. You sort of see in between the two branches, and it sort of creates a glitch in the matrix, or a flaw in the fabric of reality, which you can see through time and space. Others have said that in these tween times, either at dawn or dusk, there is the opportunity to have a look at these beings. We've also heard that if you're on a bridge, it's neither up nor down, and you're just in between time and space. And this also is true of the seasons of the year. If you're looking at various times of the solstices, for example, in a previous conversation, we had talked to Philip at the Brazen Head pub back in Dublin, and he told us traditionally the holiday of Halloween, or Samhain, comes from the idea of the Trooping Fairies. The Trooping Fairies were said to come out at that time because that's when the veils were very thin in between both worlds, and during the solstices and changing of the seasons, that's when these beings from the other dimensions or spirit world could come through, and the Trooping Fairies would come out, and you didn't want to have an encounter with them that would be unpleasant. So between them and the other beings that were out, people would take turnips and carve them at that time of the year, which then, in North America turned into the pumpkin. But I think it's all very interesting. Some of these other traditions that came about was covering one eye, and others will leave out various treats for the fairies. But the thing that's supposed to draw the little people in the most, which they absolutely love, is they really like to party and have fun. So they really love storytelling, dancing, and good music. And when you're out in nature, you might just step into a fairy ring or a fairy circle that could be left from the night before from them dancing. Sometimes that can be mushrooms or fungus that goes across the ground. Others attribute this to underground mycelium, another phenomena. So we're going to walk through this forest today and see if we can encounter some fairy beings. Have a look around at this beautiful place.
Later on, the other group of fairies to talk about are the solitary fairies. And they're the ones that you're most familiar with because they're the ones that seek out human contact. But before I tell you about that, I want to go back to this thing of the relationship between the church and this fairy world. Originally, it was quite harmonious. It was kind of, the new Christianity let the old order continue on. But after a while, it became a power struggle. And the stories that we were given of the origins of the fairy world were twofold. One was that the fairies were fallen angels. Well, by definition, if they're fallen angels, then the Christian ideal has to be enhanced. The other story was that the fairies are members of a tribe, a superhuman tribe called the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danann. And it was said that the Tuatha De Danann had been defeated in battle by the Miletians, who came from Spain. And after the battle, the negotiations, it was agreed that the Tuatha De Danann would live below the ground, becoming those deities that I mentioned, while the Miletians lived above the ground, becoming us, the aliens. And this
I believe that, like fairies, if you go to very special places, there's an eerie sensation, but at the same time, you feel that you're being watched. I know when sometimes you're walking down the street and you have that same sensation, and you're in, could be a large city like New York or London, and you feel it being watched, although there's nobody in the street, but you look to your left or your right and you'll see somebody out the window looking at you, and they're watching you, and you sense that vision, you sense another being observing what you're doing. Well, there's various places in Ireland that you'll actually feel that as well, and it's in nature, where you're just alone, but at the same time you're being watched.
Do you think we're getting less of that nowadays with all these big metropolises and unnatural cities, all the electromagnetic pollution that these
Well, I think maybe not less, but I believe that they just hide deeper.
Yes.
Into nature, and we've lost contact with the whole thing because we're just, we don't connect with nature. We're on our mobile phones consistently, looking at the internet, and people don't even know the different trees that are on the street. They don't know the plants that are around them. They don't realise the connection with nature is just lost, and I think it's sad really, because I always grew up, even years ago, if you got stung by a nettle, you used to use a dock leaf, and a dock leaf would cure, and sure enough it would, and even small things like that today, it's just lost. I think we just have too much head on a computer screen to gather that. But I have experienced strange connections with, for example, just around this area here, it's very strong in different powers, energy fields. At the end of the day, fairies are like as you say, it's like the guardians of nature. She can just have to speak to her. She's not very happy with what's going on.
What parts of Ireland now do you think where the old Shanakees still are, where Faerie Faith
Well,
is still
definitely
strong?
Uisneach, the hill of Uisneach, which is in Tara as well, Meath, County Meath. It's near Tara, it's not far from Tara. Which definitely, and the hill of Tara itself is very strong energy forces there.
So we have the Cliffs of Moher behind us, and these were said to have inspired J.R. Tolkien to make his Lord of the Rings and Hobbit series. But when you think about places like this existing on the earth, very magical places that have inspired writers and thinkers, it can only make you wonder. Take a look. We just left the Cliffs of Moher, and as I mentioned, we were talking about J.R. Tolkien and how he was inspired by the Cliffs of Moher to make The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. And there is also another connection there that we see with a cave called Gollum, and as you know, he has a character called Gollum. Many other serious researchers and authors have looked at this subject, including Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the author of Sherlock Holmes. But when we were leaving Killarney, we spoke to one couple that shared a very interesting story with us. This fellow's wife had told us that growing up, her brother and her dad had heard stories about fairy mounts and fairy forts, and they had one on their property, and they were told not to plow it over or they would have bad luck. Well, sure enough, the brother did, and after that he became very ill. He was secluded in his room where he felt cold presences, and they feel to this day it was because of upsetting the trooping fairies. Well, today we're out at the Hill of Tara, and as you see behind me, there are several mounds that some might call sacred portal burial sites. And others would look at these as being as places of great ritual significance. But either way, this faith and the belief in fairies is still alive and well in Ireland. Those that believe in them say that they tend to show up in places where there's a lot of nature around, bees and butterflies popping around, maybe where you have Shasta daisies growing and buddleias. Others tend to tell us that they shapeshift a lot and they might show up in the form of an animal. Or if you're walking out in the middle of a field on a beautiful day, you might feel like you had cobwebs in your face, but there was nothing else around. So I'm going to leave it with all of you and let you decide what you believe. But I want to go on record saying I believe in fairies.